All right. Well, thank you, Kara Powell, for joining us today. And just for the people watching, my name is Darren. I'm one of our pastors at our Anaheim campus. But this is Kara Powell, and she has written resources and books that, as a church, we use all the time. For myself, I use as well. She's the executive director at the Fuller Youth Institute, but also on staff at Fuller. And then you have a few books. So, Sticky Faith, which for our church, soon as we all jumped on that and read that, we made some immediate changes on how do we best keep students involved in church as they're moving into adulthood, but also even small curriculum. Can I ask that? So you've written a lot of great resources. You were one of the first people I wanted to reach out to and just begin a conversation.
Well, thanks, Darren. I'm looking forward to it.
Great. Just kind of get our conversation going right now. In our world, we're hearing a lot, and I get a lot of conversations and questions from parents that, hey, when I grew up, I feel like the stress and anxiety and the things going on weren't something that I dealt with or something that I saw as prevalent, which today it feels like it's just becoming common practice. It's a norm to talk about stress, anxiety, and some of those things. Any thoughts on why it's different today than 10, 15 years ago?
Yeah. Well, I just affirm that as a leader and a researcher and a fellow parent, I feel like every day somebody's asking me a question about anxiety, depression, sometimes even suicide. So it is more and more poignant and present in our culture and in our young people. You ask a good question, like, why are we hearing so much more about it? And I'll be honest, as a researcher, we don't totally know why there's this increase. We have some pretty good hunches, and I'd love to share some of those, but we don't have a definitive answer. But it does seem like there's at least 4 factors that I like to point to when it comes to the increase in mental health challenges for young people and their families these days. First is, and this is what we probably hear the most about, is technology. This is a cell phone, in case you don't know what a cell phone is.
Sure.
And let me just say, I love technology. I'm able to talk to you thanks to technology. And even though I'm very pro-technology, technology brings a lot of stress. For young people, it brings a fear of missing out, or FOMO. You know, when I was a teenager, if I missed a Friday night party, if I wasn't invited to a Friday night party, I maybe heard about it on Monday morning.
Sure.
Our kids today, when they're not invited to a Friday night party, like, they see it unfold in real time in front of them on their devices. So I think there's a much more of a feeling of rejection, not being included, that's more prevalent because of phones. And so that creates anxiety and stress for young people. And then the other thing is our technology is often a distraction or something we use to soothe ourselves when we are feeling uncomfortable. So there are some researchers, and I think there's probably some validity here, that think that because young people, and those of us over 30 also, when we start to feel uncomfortable, we kind of grab that phone and we go on to our favorite social media platform, or we watch YouTube videos or whatever it might be, and we're not developing some of the resilience and grit that comes from sitting with those tough emotions. So technology is one factor. It's certainly not all technology, though. I think many of our parenting styles are playing a part in increasing mental health challenges. And okay. Let me just say, I'm looking in the mirror on this one as a parent. I'd really love to rescue my kids from all pain. I hate seeing my kids go through pain. And yet, as a friend and colleague at Fuller, Scott Cormode says, as parents, we want to protect our kids from pain on the one hand. And then we want them to have the growth and character and resilience that only comes from working through pain. It's kind of this like paradox, and it's so tempting to swoop in and rescue our kids. And again, they don't have that chance to work through some of those tougher emotions. I think the third thing is we families are just busy, and Southern California families especially. There's no margin to deal with pressure. I've heard a good rule of thumb for teenagers is that they have at least 25% of their waking hours unscheduled. And certainly before COVID, it was the rare teenager that had that much free time. I think kids now have a little bit more free time.
Yeah.
At least my kids certainly do.
For sure.
But it's just the busyness. And then the last thing I would say is our brain is an organ. And like our heart and our lungs, like any organ sometimes gets out of whack. Sometimes our brain gets out of whack. So So those are kind of the major factors. I will say this, Darren, that I think in this pandemic, I know in this pandemic, there are greater mental health challenges. Mental health hotlines are seeing a 40% increase in people who are reaching out to them, and 75% of those who are reaching out now are under 25. So you and your team are very wise to have this conversation now. It's important all the time, but in this season of greater stress and fear and isolation, I think it's even more important.
What you said, 75% are under 25?
Yeah, and who have been reaching out to mental health hotlines. Yes.
Wow.
That's the latest data that I heard. So, yes, so that is alarming.
Yeah.
And an opportunity for us to think about, okay, what new tools do parents need then in order to reach out to their kids and better pay attention and be mindful of what's going on with their kids?
Sure. Well, I mean, let's move in that direction then.
Yeah.
So, while they're at school, I have some parents and volunteers that actually work at school in mental health departments and things like that. But now that they're at home, some of those resources have changed. What as parents can we be talking to our children about? What as youth pastors, youth workers, what can we be focusing on?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing I want to say is I just want us to have the conversation at church and at home. As parents know who are listening to this, who are connected with schools, schools are really training teachers and school volunteers in mental health, how to look out for mental health struggle. Schools are talking about mental health so much. I have a college freshman and a high school junior, as well as an eighth grader. But thanks to my older two kids, like my part-time job for the last few years has been college tours. Like I feel like I've been to so many college campuses, and at every single one, they talk about the mental health resources that they're offering. And sadly, families are silent about it all too often, and the church is silent about it all too often. So that's part of what we want to do at the Full Youth Institute, is just make families and churches a place where it's okay to talk about our struggles. And if I can just say this one last thing, a lot of our kids may not be struggling, but they know kids who are struggling. And I think it's often a peer who sees signs of distress, discouragement in their friends, or even, kids will go to their friends. And in fact, we've developed some new anxiety resources, and one of the couples that helped fund it, this was their story. Their teenage son was struggling. They're great parents. They didn't see the struggle. And the teenage son told a friend, hey, I'm really not doing very well, but you can't tell anybody. And so that friend didn't tell anybody. And then that young man ended up dying by suicide, and just devastating so many people, especially the parents and that one friend who were kind of, the friend being sworn to secrecy. So we need to talk about this, not just for our kids, but for other kids who our kids know.
Yeah, well, there's maybe it's an incorrect thought, but there's this thought of, if I talk about it, am I going to provoke that thought, or am I going to cause them to think about something that they're not already?
I'm so glad you raised that, Darren, because honestly, that's one of, I think, the biggest mistakes that parents make, is being afraid that if I bring it up, I'm going to make it worse. What we hear from young people is they're by and large generally really relieved to have a chance to talk about it. And again, the conversation is happening in so many places. It's odd to young people when it's not happening at home or at church. I mean, in California, it was actually recently legislated by our state government that every middle school and high school student ID has to have the National Suicide Prevention Hotline on it. So parents of middle school and high schoolers, go to your kids. My two daughters who are in middle school and high school, like the back of their IDs, have that information. That's how ubiquitous the conversation is, kind of, in the school environment and even on social media. And so again, we can't be silent at home. And I mean, just getting really practical. A couple weeks ago, I was just in this 48-hour period where I was hearing so much about suicide. Like, it was honestly just overwhelming. Young people who had contemplated suicide, young people who had died by suicide. I mean, it was breathtaking. And I said to my husband, Dave, I said, we need to have this conversation again with our kids. And so before we tucked each of our kids in that night, they're 19, 17, and almost 14. So they actually stay up later than we do, but we still do a, tucking in ritual.
Sure.
And as we were tucking each of them in one at a time, we looked up in the eye and said, and I said, I've honestly been hearing a lot more about suicide in the last few days, and I just need to know how you're doing. Are you worried about anybody else? You can always talk to us about anything. And so, in families, I want the sex talk to be a series of talks, not just one talk that parents have with their kids once. And the same thing needs to be true with mental health. It's not just one talk, but it's a series of talks that we need to have, especially when we see any signs in our kids.
Okay, so what does that talk look like? That the fear of like just going and bringing that up to my child feels terrifying. So what does that talk look like?
Yeah. Well, if folks go to our website, fulleryouthinstitute.org/anxiousworld, or if you just go to fulleryouthinstitute.org, we give parents some really practical tools, and we have podcasts to help parents know how to talk to their kids. We've interviewed so many amazing therapists and theologians and biblical scholars on mental health. I feel like I've gotten a crash course in mental health in the last year. And what was interesting, Darren, is as I was looking over like all these notes from all these amazing conversations, I realized I think there's really 5 things that I want parents to know, 5 things that I want a parent to do when they're worried about what's going on with their kid. And they spell out A, B, C, D, E. Now, I'm usually a little skeptical of alliteration and, word patterns like that.
That's how we work at Saddleback. So.
Yeah, it was like, wow, that just is that way. So, if it feels forced to anybody, I apologize, but it's more to be memorable. And it really is just how the notes came. But, so A, ask your young person on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being, I'm not feeling anxiety at all. 10 being, I'm really struggling with anxiety. How are you doing? We got this great suggestion from a therapist who focuses on adolescent anxiety. And he says, this is a question any adult can ask a kid. Scale of 1 to 10, how are you doing? 1 to 3, you don't need to worry about. 4 to 5, handleable. It's at 6 or above that as a parent or step parent, grandparent, guardian, you want to think about what additional resources and support, how do I want to surround my young person with more if they're that 6 or above? And so, that is a great entree. And you know what, you can use other things as an excuse if you want to say something before that. I mean, even, hey, I was listening to this conversation about, mental health that Saddleback sent out. And it made me wonder, there's so many things in our world you can springboard off of when it comes to mental health. So, but that's the A, ask. Okay. And then that can help you rally and get support. Here's the B, and we heard this again from multiple therapists, is to help your young person, if they're feeling stressed, to breathe deeply. Now, my whole life, I've heard the importance of taking deep breaths. And I never understood why until I studied it this last year.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, exactly. So I learned a little anatomy in this last year. But, God's designed us that when we're afraid, when that adrenaline kicks in, we have a flight or fight reflex, and our heart begins to beat faster to try to get blood to all of our extremities. So, we start feeling more stressed. It's like this automatic gas pedal. And part of the problem for our young people is they walk around like that far too much of the time. And so God's actually given us a wonderful brake pedal, and that is to breathe. That when we breathe, when we take a deep breath, that cues our heart, hey, we're getting more oxygen. The heart feels like it doesn't have to work so hard. Heart rate decreases. Brain gets the message that we're out of danger. And so literally we can help calm ourselves down and help our kids do that. So that's the B.
Okay.
C is help your young person, your child, your teenager, center on a helpful truth or phrase. What's a helpful truth or phrase that can be their anchor when they're struggling? For our kids, since our kids were little, one of our big phrases has been Emmanuel, God is with us. And so, when our kids are doing something tough, I will often text them and say, hey, Emmanuel, praying for you. And that's kind of our little code, God is with you. Another one of our kids, when they're feeling anxious, they have a particular worship song that they sing. And there's, some of those lyrics are really meaningful to them. So it varies person to person. But this is actually a good thing to talk to your kid about now. Like, hey, you know what? If you ever were anxious, what might be something good for you to remember? Like, is there a song that you like, or particular Bible verses? With our kids, when they felt anxious, we've actually looked at different Bible verses together, and they're like, oh, that one doesn't help. Ooh, but that one really does. So find that helpful truth or phrase to center on. The D is develop a team. Parenting is not a solo sport. I love that, you all at Saddleback are offering these kinds of resources. I know you want parents to journey together and, help your young person think about a team that they can go to. If they're nervous about online physics, then is there somebody in their class that they could text if they're feeling anxious, and that they could just say, hey, if I reach out to you, it's because I'm feeling this. If they're anxious about other things, extracurricularly, virtually, or in person, is there an adult they can share? Do you need to involve a therapist? Again, the brain's an organ, and while God works through prayer and scripture and community, sometimes how God works is through trained professionals. And so, do you need to involve a mental health professional as part of that team? And then the last of the 5 is empathize. Empathize, really feel with your kid. I think most good leadership, most good marriage, and most good parenting boils down to, have we empathize with the people that we care about so deeply? And I've been really influenced as a parent in all things, but especially in anxiety, by the work of Lisa Damour, who talks about DAMOUR, who talks about the importance of empathy that empowers, that we don't just want to feel with our kids, but how do we kind of help them take a next step? And she offers a phrase that is such a good phrase for parents and step parents, for mental health, as well as lots of things when it comes to parenting. Here's her phrase: that stinks, and I think you might be able to handle it. So, 2 powerful parts of that phrase. You start with something like that stinks, or, oh, that's hard. Oh, I would be disappointed too. Man, if I had so many AP tests, I would be anxious. You're right. That teacher's giving you a lot of homework. That's hard. That's that empathy with that young person.
Right.
And then
where they're at. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You're reflecting that you've listened, you understand what they're going through. But then how do you help them not just be stuck there, but take a step forward? So, either, well, what do you think your best options are? Or how can I help you as you're thinking about what to do next? Or I bet you can figure out what to do tomorrow. What do you think? So, there's some kind of empowering aspect to it. So, the essence is that stinks, and I think you can handle it. But, we all as parents, we can adapt it to what fits us and our kids and the moment best. So that's a great phrase to keep in your hip pocket. So ask, breathe, center, develop, and empathize.
Oh, I love that.
All right. Hopefully not too corny or hokey.
What? Oh, no. Love it. Yeah, it helps me remember. So, going with the centering and going back to Bible verses, parents, you hear it around the church, there's kind of that, like, don't be anxious about everything. Proverbs 4, like, you're good. Just God says, don't be anxious. So just don't be. Obviously that's not good enough. So how do we as kind of respond to that?
Yeah. And I will say I've made a lot of mistakes in this area as a teacher, more as a teacher than as a parent. But and I love Philippians 4, 6, and 7. And, that is a Bible verse that has been helpful to one of our kids. Be anxious about nothing, but in all things, with prayer and thanksgiving, present your requests to God. So, I love that Bible verse. I memorized it myself as a teenager or college student. And sometimes prayer and scripture can be so helpful. It's just that. Sometimes, again, the brain is an organ, and sometimes young people have gone through trauma, or the situations are just so overwhelming that they need prayer and the Bible, as well as some other more intensive, often structured, maybe even professional help. Sometimes young people find that there are particular medicines that are prescribed that are really meaningful, that again restore that brain chemistry. So I'm embarrassed to say this, Darren, but I once gave a talk. This is so embarrassing. I once gave a talk that anxiety is a form of atheism. This was 15 years ago. That if we're worrying, we're not trusting God.
Oh.
Is that true? Yeah, I guess in some ways that's true. but that's so simplistic. I mean, like I said, I'm embarrassed that I used to think that, because anxiety is a real thing. It's more real than ever for young people. It's more real than ever given this pandemic. And so one can be a dedicated follower of Jesus and still really struggle with anxiety.
Yes, anxiety, depression, all of them.
Absolutely.
All right, so just kind of wrap up. Parents are looking for more resources, more help, more information. Where can they go? Where can they find
Yeah,
it?
yeah. Well, because parents were asking us so many questions, as well as youth leaders like you, we actually developed a whole suite of resources that are at fulleryouthinstitute.org/anxious world. But if that's too much to remember, just go to fulleryouthinstitute.org. And we have parent podcasts, which are some of these amazing conversations with therapists and theologians and parents that we recorded and edited. So those are free resources for parents. We also have some great blog posts and other tips and downloadable tools for parents. So that would be the number one place where I would recommend that parents go.
Perfect. I love it. And then just kind of one final thing to end on. If you have one piece of advice, a tip, something maybe parents need to know, what would be your kind of, I wish all parents knew this?
Yeah, yeah. I wish all parents understood the influence that they have. I've studied a lot about young people's faith, and are friends important? You bet they are. Are youth leaders like you, Darren, important? You bet you are. But if you look at the best research on really the formation of young people, the research shows there's no factor more important than a parent, and step parent, guardian, et cetera. I'm a daughter of divorce, so I'm very empathetic. My whole life was mom and Jim and dad and Helen. Like, to say mom and dad together is like a weird phrase for me. So, I understand and have very much been blessed by some amazing step parents. So just that adult who's really, raising you and forming you. And I know sometimes as a parent, it feels like, oh my gosh, you're saying things and it's just bouncing off a wall. And I know sometimes your kids can wear you down, and they're good at pushing your buttons. At least my kids are. They know how to get
All of
me.
them.
Yeah, exactly. But I just want to encourage parents that you are planting seeds that you're not even seeing the work that God is doing. Just like when a seed is planted and it's in the ground and it doesn't look like anything is happening, but God is working. And the conversations you have, the prayers that you offer, the patience that you show, the way that you tangibly love, the way that you ask that extra question about mental health, like that makes such a difference. And you plant those seeds, God and others water them as well as you do. And that fruit can come. Often it takes longer than we expect, but we are planting seeds for the long-term fruit that's going to come in and through our kids. So it's hard. Parenting is the hardest thing I do by far. But I take comfort knowing that everything that I do every day, it adds up. So be encouraged, parents.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. I mean, so many practical tools in there. So I'm excited to spend some time over on Fuller Institute.
Yeah, please do.
All
Thanks,
right.
Dave.
Well, thank you. Have a good one.
Bye.